The fluorescent lights of courtroom 4B hummed overhead as Judge Michael Whitman adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses, scanning the docket for the next case. At 52, he carried himself with the measured confidence that came from 15 years on the bench. His salt and pepper hair and crisp black robe projected an image of authority that defendants had learned to respect or fear. Case number 2024 TR 789. The State versus Sarah Johnson. The bailiff announced, his voice echoing through the half-empty courtroom. Sarah Johnson stepped forward, her worn leather shoes making soft sounds against the polished floor. She was dressed in what Judge Whitman recognized as someone's best attempt at courtroom attire. A slightly faded navy blazer, a white blouse with a small coffee stain near the collar, and black pants that had seen better days. Her hair was pulled back in a neat bun, revealing features that seemed strangely familiar to him, though he couldn't place why. Ms. Johnson, Judge Whitman began, his voice carrying the same stern tone he'd used for thousands of cases before. You're here today facing multiple unpaid traffic violations spanning the past 8 months. According to the record, you've missed 2 previous court dates. How do you plead? Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she gripped the edge of the defendant's table. Guilty, Your Honor, but I'd like to explain. The court acknowledges your guilty plea, Judge Whitman interrupted, already reaching for his gavel. He'd heard every excuse imaginable over the years, and his patience for sob stories had worn thin. Please, Your Honor, Sarah persisted, her voice steady despite her obvious nervousness. I'm a single mother of 2. I lost my job at the hospital during layoffs, and I've been working 2 part-time jobs trying to make ends meet. The tickets, they're from when I was rushing between jobs, trying to pick up my kids from school. Judge Whitman felt a flicker of annoyance. Ms. Johnson, while the court sympathizes with your situation, the law doesn't make exceptions for personal circumstances. You've accumulated $1,250 in fines, plus court costs. The penalties for missed court dates bring the total to $1,875. Sarah's shoulders slumped slightly, but she stood straight, maintaining her dignity. I understand, Your Honor. Would it be possible to arrange a payment plan? I can pay something each month. Given your history of missed appearances and payments, the court is not inclined to grant another extension. Judge Whitman shuffled through the papers before him, missing the way Sarah's eyes suddenly welled with tears. The full amount is due within 30 days, or you'll face additional penalties, including possible license suspension. From her seat in the gallery, an elderly woman with graying hair wrapped in a floral scarf watched intently, her weathered hands clasped tightly in her lap. She seemed to study Judge Whitman's face with an intensity that would have unnerved him had he noticed. But Your Honor, Sarah tried one last time. The gavel came down with a sharp crack. This is not a negotiation, Ms. Johnson. The court has made its ruling. Next case. As Sarah gathered her worn leather purse and turned to leave, something in her profile, the proud tilt of her chin, the set of her jaw, triggered a distant memory in Judge Whitman's mind. It reminded him of someone, but the thought slipped away before he could grasp it. He pushed the nagging feeling aside, already focusing on the next case number being called. Neither he nor Sarah could have known that this seemingly routine traffic court appearance would soon unravel both their lives in ways they could never have imagined. The antiseptic smell of Memorial Hospital's room 415 burned Sarah's nostrils as she sank into the hard plastic chair beside her mother's bed. The steady beeping of monitors provided a rhythmic backdrop to Grace Johnson's labored breathing. Through the window, the setting sun painted the room in hues of orange and purple, casting long shadows across the worn linoleum floor. "Baby girl," Grace whispered, her once strong voice now barely audible above the medical equipment's hum. "How did court go today?" Sarah forced a smile, trying to shield her mother from more worry. "Don't concern yourself with that, Mama. You need to rest." But Grace's eyes, though tired, retained their characteristic sharpness. "I saw how you were holding your purse strap. You always do that when you're upset." She patted the bed beside her. "Come closer, Sarah. There's something I need to tell you, something I should have told you years ago." Sarah moved to perch carefully on the edge of the hospital bed, mindful of the IV tubes. Her mother's hand, once strong from years of typing legal documents, felt papery and fragile in hers. "Do you remember those photos I keep in the blue box under my bed?" Grace asked, each word seeming to cost her precious energy. "The ones I never let you look at." Sarah nodded, recalling her childhood curiosity about that mysterious box, how her mother would quickly change the subject whenever she asked about it. "James Whitman," Grace said, the name falling from her lips like a long-held secret finally breaking free. "He was your father." The words hung in the air between them as Sarah's world tilted on its axis. "James Whitman," she repeated, the surname triggering a fresh wave of anxiety after her courthouse encounter earlier that day. Grace's eyes filled with tears as she continued. "I was his legal secretary in '88. He was different from other lawyers at the firm. Kind. Saw me as more than just the black girl who typed his briefs." She paused, catching her breath. "We fell in love, Sarah. Real love, even though we both knew it couldn't last." Sarah's mind raced, trying to process this revelation. "But you always said my father died before I was born." "It was easier than the truth," Grace admitted, guilt etching lines around her eyes. "When I found out I was pregnant, I couldn't tell them. His father was running for state senate. The scandal would have destroyed everything his family had built. And in those days," she shook her head slowly, "a white lawyer and his black secretary. This town wasn't ready for that." Reaching beneath her pillow with trembling hands, Grace withdrew an envelope, yellowed with age. "These are for you. Photos, letters, proof of who you are. James passed away 2 years ago. I saw it in the paper, but you deserve to know your history, baby girl, to understand where you come from." Sarah opened the envelope with shaking fingers, pulling out a stack of photographs. The first showed a younger version of her mother, radiant in a summer dress, standing beside a tall, distinguished-looking white man with kind eyes and a familiar smile. "That was taken at Willow Creek Park," Grace said softly. "The day he told me he loved me." Her breath caught, and she squeezed Sarah's hand. "But there's more you need to know. James had another family, a son." She closed her eyes briefly, gathering strength. "His name is Michael. He's a judge now." The room seemed to spin as Sarah recalled the stern face from traffic court, the nagging feeling of familiarity she'd felt standing before him. "Judge Michael Whitman," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "My brother." Back in her small apartment, Sarah sat cross-legged on her bed, surrounded by the contents of her mother's blue box. Her children were asleep in the next room, their soft breathing providing a gentle counterpoint to the storm raging in her mind. The digital clock on her nightstand blinked 2:47 a.m., but sleep was the furthest thing from her thoughts. Her fingers traced the edges of another photograph. James Whitman at his law office, leaning against a mahogany desk, his confident smile eerily similar to the one she saw in her own mirror. The inscription on the back read, "To Grace, the office isn't the same without your smile. James, 1988. Sarah's laptop cast a blue glow across her face as she typed "James Whitman Lawyer" into the search bar. The results populated quickly. Obituaries, law firm histories, charity foundation mentions. Her heart caught as she clicked on his obituary from 2 years ago. James Edward Whitman, prominent attorney and philanthropist, passed away peacefully at his home. The words blurred as she scanned down to the survivors list. He is survived by his wife of 40 years, Margaret, and their son, the Honorable Judge Michael Whitman. A social media link led her to a recent photo of Judge Michael Whitman at a charity gala. Sarah's hand trembled as she held up one of James's old photos next to the screen. The resemblance was undeniable. The same strong jawline, the same way of holding their head, even the same slight crook in their smile. Features she now recognized in her own face. "Oh God," she whispered, running her fingers through her hair that had the same slight wave as James's, though few would notice it in her different texture. She thought back to that morning in court, how Judge Whitman had dismissed her so easily, without a second glance. Her own brother had fined her without knowing who she was. Sarah opened another tab, researching Judge Michael Whitman more thoroughly. Yale Law School graduate, youngest judge appointed to the district court, married to Caroline Bennett Whitman, father of 2 children. Her niece and nephew, she realized with a start. There were photos of him at law conferences, charity events, family gatherings. The life of privilege she might have known, had circumstances been different. In one photo, taken at James's funeral, she spotted her mother in the background, dressed in black, standing far from the family. Grace had gone to pay her respects, carrying the weight of their secret even then. Sarah's throat tightened as she remembered her mother's words from all those years ago when she'd asked about her father. He was a good man who made hard choices. Her phone buzzed. A text from the hospital. Her mother's condition was deteriorating. Sarah quickly gathered the scattered photos, her hands lingering on one final image. James and Grace at a park, caught in a candid moment, both laughing at something long forgotten. Their happiness seemed to radiate from the faded photograph, making the reality of their separation all the more poignant. As she carefully placed everything back in the blue box, Sarah's eyes fell on her court documents, still lying on her dresser. The signature at the bottom, Judge Michael Whitman, seemed to mock her with its authority. Her brother's signature, condemning her to fines she couldn't pay. She pulled out a sheet of her children's school stationery and began to write. Dear Judge Whitman, you don't know me, but earlier today you presided over my traffic violation case. What I'm about to tell you will change both our lives forever. The words flowed slowly at first, then faster, as 35 years of hidden truth poured onto the page. For 5 days, the letter sat unfinished on Sarah's small desk, each version telling the same truth in different ways. Crumpled attempts filled her wastebasket, each one a testament to the weight of the words she struggled to perfect. Outside her apartment window, the city moved in its usual rhythm, unaware of the life-changing revelation she was attempting to craft. Mama, why are you always writing? Her 8-year-old daughter Lily asked one evening, peering over her shoulder at the latest draft. Sarah pulled her daughter close, breathing in the familiar scent of her strawberry shampoo. Sometimes, baby, grown-ups need to tell important things to other grown-ups, and finding the right words can be hard. At the hospital, Grace's condition stabilized enough for her to read Sarah's latest attempt. Her mother's hands shook as she held the pages, but her eyes remained sharp and focused. Dear Judge Whitman, Grace read aloud, her voice barely above a whisper. I've started this letter 100 times, each attempt falling short of conveying the magnitude of what I need to share. The truth is, we share more than just a courthouse encounter. We share a father. Grace lowered the letter to her lap. It's good, baby. Direct but respectful. James would have appreciated that about it. Sarah perched on the edge of the hospital bed, fidgeting with her mother's blanket. What if he doesn't believe me? What if he thinks this is just some scheme to get out of paying the fines? That's why we're including the proof, Grace responded, gesturing to the small stack of photographs and letters they'd carefully selected. The love letter your father wrote me when he thought he might be transferred to the Atlanta office. The photo of us at his firm's Christmas party. His handwritten notes about baby names he liked. She paused, catching her breath. No one could fake these. Back at home that evening, Sarah added the final touches to the package. She included a formal request for a DNA test, making it clear she wasn't seeking financial gain or public acknowledgement. I have lived my entire life not knowing half of who I am, she wrote. I'm not asking for money or to disrupt your life. I simply want to know my medical history for my children's sake, and perhaps, if you're willing, to learn about the father I never knew. She sealed the envelope, then unsealed it again, adding one final note. I understand if you need time to process this information. I've had 35 years to live with this truth, and you're learning it in the space of a letter. Take whatever time you need. I'll respect your decision either way." As she slipped the final version of the letter into her purse the next morning, her hands trembled. The package felt impossibly heavy, weighted with decades of secrets and unspoken truths. She'd requested personal delivery to Judge Whitman's chambers, knowing this wasn't something to trust to regular mail. "Your mother would be proud," her best friend Tamika said over the phone when Sarah called for last-minute courage. "It takes real strength to reach out like this." Standing before the courthouse steps, Sarah clutched the envelope to her chest. The same building that had witnessed their first unknowing encounter as siblings would now become the site of their true introduction. She thought of her children, of their right to know their heritage, of her mother's fading health, and of the father she never knew but whose blood ran through her veins. Taking a deep breath, she climbed the steps, each one bringing her closer to a truth that would change not just her life, but the lives of everyone in the Whitman family forever. Judge Michael Whitman sat alone in his chambers, the heavy leather chair that usually felt like a throne now seeming to swallow him whole. The contents of Sarah's envelope lay scattered across his mahogany desk. Photographs, letters, and memories he never knew existed. His father's handwriting stared back at him from yellowed pages, unmistakable in its familiar slant. "I dream of a world where our love wouldn't have to hide," his father had written to Grace, "where the color of our skin wouldn't matter more than the content of our hearts." The date on the letter was June 15, 1988, 3 months before Michael's 16th birthday. He remembered that summer clearly, his father working late, his mother's tight-lipped smiles at dinner, the tension he'd attributed to teenage self-absorption. His hand trembled as he picked up a photograph. His father and Grace Johnson at what appeared to be an office Christmas party, standing slightly apart but looking at each other with undisguised affection. Michael remembered that party. He'd stopped by with his mother to pick up his father. Grace had been there, efficient and professional, handling the coat check. He'd never noticed the way his father's eyes followed her movements. "Your Honor," his clerk's voice crackled through the intercom. "Your 3 o'clock appointment is here." "Cancel everything," he responded, his voice hoarse. "Cancel the rest of the day." He pulled out his phone, fingers hovering over his wife Caroline's number before setting it aside. How could he explain this to her when he couldn't even make sense of it himself? Their wedding photo sat on his desk, his father beaming proudly as he delivered the toast, speaking of family legacy and the importance of honor. Had he thought of Grace then? Of the daughter he'd never acknowledged, the daughter who had stood in his courtroom just days ago. Michael pulled up Sarah's case file on his computer. He studied her photo, seeing his father's features for the first time. The same determined jaw, the same arch of the eyebrows. How had he missed it? The system noted multiple citations for expired tags, speeding, running yellow lights, all between 5:30 and 6:00 p.m. School pickup times, he realized. A single mother rushing between jobs to care for her children. His children, her niece and nephew, attended private school with door-to-door transportation. A knock at his chamber door startled him. "I said cancel everything," he called out. "It's just me, Your Honor," his longtime bailiff, Robert, responded. "Brought you some coffee. You missed lunch." Michael stared at his father's watch on his wrist, a graduation gift he'd worn every day since law school. The same watch visible in one of the photos with Grace, catching the light as his father's hand rested casually on her shoulder. "Leave it outside, Robert. Thank you." He picked up another letter, this one from Sarah herself. "I don't want to disrupt your life," she'd written, "but I believe we both deserve to know the truth of who we are." The truth. His father, James Edward Whitman, pillar of the community, champion of conservative values, had lived a double life. Had loved a black woman in secret. Had a daughter he never claimed. And Michael, who had built his career on upholding the law, on maintaining order, had found his own sister without knowing who she was. Had dismissed her struggles with the same blind privilege his father had wielded in abandoning her. The irony felt like a physical wave on his chest. Rising unsteadily, He walked to his window overlooking the courthouse square. The same view his father had enjoyed during his years on the bench. How many other secrets had these walls witnessed? How many other lives had been shaped by the decisions made here, cloaked in the false authority of tradition and propriety? His reflection stared back at him, his father's features now a reminder of inherited responsibility and inherited sins. The DNA testing facility was clinical and impersonal, its stark white walls and antiseptic smell a sharp contrast to the deeply personal nature of what was happening within. Sarah and Judge Whitman had arranged to come at different times, avoiding an encounter neither felt ready for yet. But now, 2 weeks later, they sat in separate locations, each staring at identical emails on their screens. Probability of half-sibling relationship, 99.9%. Sarah read the results in her mother's hospital room, Grace's thin hand clutched tightly in hers. The steady beep of medical monitors provided a rhythm to their shared silence. Outside, a spring storm painted rivulets on the window, matching the tears that slid down Sarah's cheeks. "I knew," Grace whispered, her voice weak but clear. "A mother always knows. You have his smile, his way of tilting your head when you're thinking hard about something." Across town, in his private chambers, Judge Michael Whitman sat rigid in his leather chair, the email displaying on his monitor like an accusation. He'd already known, really. The photos, the letters, the undeniable resemblance. The DNA test was just final confirmation of a truth his heart had already accepted. His wife Caroline sat across from him, her face pale but composed. He'd finally told her everything the night before, preparing her for today's results. "What are you going to do?" she asked softly, watching his face with concern. Michael removed his glasses, pinching the bridge of his nose. "I've been looking through her case files," he admitted. "Not just the traffic violations, everything. She put herself through community college while working full-time. Raised 2 kids alone. Never asked for help." His voice cracked. "While I was attending Yale on Dad's legacy admission." Caroline reached across the desk, taking his hand. "You can't change the past, Michael, but you can decide what happens next." He nodded, pulling out his phone. The text was simple. Results confirmed what we already knew. "Would you be willing to meet? Your choice of place and time." Sarah's response came quickly. "Grace, our mother, doesn't have much time left. Would you consider coming to the hospital?" Michael felt his heart constrict. He'd known of Grace's condition from the letter, but had been avoiding thinking about it directly. Now, faced with the possibility of meeting both his sister and the woman his father had loved in secret, he felt overwhelmed by the weight of decades of unspoken truths. "When?" He typed back. "Tomorrow morning. She's usually strongest then." He looked up at Caroline, who nodded encouragingly. "I'll be there," he replied. That night, neither sibling slept well. Sarah sat by her mother's bedside, scrolling through old photos on her phone, seeing her father's features in her own face with new clarity. Michael stood in his home study, staring at the family photos on the wall. Pictures of his father at his law school graduation, at his wedding, holding Michael's children as babies. So many moments Sarah should have shared. In a quiet corner of Memorial Hospital, Grace Johnson drifted in and out of sleep, a slight smile on her face. The secret she'd carried for 35 years was finally free, and tomorrow, her daughter would meet her brother. Not in a courtroom as judge and defendant, but as family. She'd carried the weight of this truth for so long. Now it was their turn to decide what to do with it. The night passed slowly, each tick of the clock bringing them closer to a meeting that would forever change their understanding of family, justice, and redemption. Memorial Hospital's 4th floor was quieter than usual that morning, as if the universe itself was creating space for the moment about to unfold. Judge Michael Whitman stepped out of the elevator, his usual courtroom confidence replaced by an unfamiliar nervousness. He'd left his suit jacket in the car, wearing just his dress shirt and tie. An unconscious attempt to appear less formal, more approachable. Sarah stood waiting by the nurse's station, her hands clasped tightly together. Their eyes met, And for a moment, neither moved. The fluorescent lights highlighted their shared features. The same determined set of their jaw, the same slight furrow between their brows when concerned. "Thank you for coming." Sarah spoke first, her voice soft but steady. "Mom's awake and ready to see us." Michael nodded, unable to find words immediately. As they walked down the corridor, he noticed Sarah's slight limp, a detail he'd overlooked in court. "Your leg," he began. "Car accident when I was 19, she explained. "The same one that forced me to drop out of nursing school. The unspoken weight of paths not taken hung between them." Grace's room was bright with morning sunlight. She looked smaller than Michael remembered from his courtroom, more fragile, but her eyes were sharp and alert. "Judge Whitman." She greeted him, a lifetime of formality hard to break. "Please," he said, his voice rougher than he intended. "Call me Michael." Grace's smile was bittersweet. "You look so much like him. Both of you do." Michael pulled a chair close to the bed, while Sarah sat on the other side. For a moment, they formed a triangle of shared history and unspoken words. "I need to know," Michael started, then paused, gathering courage. Was he happy? With you?" Grace's eyes filled with tears. "We had 18 months. Stolen moments, secret meetings. But yes, in those moments, we were happy." She reached for Sarah's hand. "When I found out I was pregnant, I knew I had to let him go. His father's Senate campaign, your mother's position in society. I couldn't destroy all that." "You sacrificed everything," Michael said, understanding flooding him. "While we had every advantage." "I had Sarah," Grace corrected gently, "and she has been worth every sacrifice." Sarah wiped tears from her cheeks. "I need to ask, the traffic fines." Michael shook his head quickly. "Already vacated. I should have listened to your explanation in court. I've been too rigid, too sure of my own righteousness." He pulled out his wallet, removing an old photograph. "I found this in Dad's study after he died. I never understood why he kept it." The photo showed a young Grace at her desk, laughing at something off camera. On the back was written simply, "My Grace." "He never stopped loving you," Michael said softly. "I remember times he'd get this faraway look, especially at family celebrations. Now I understand why." Grace closed her eyes briefly. "Love isn't always enough, but maybe now with you too." She squeezed Sarah's hand. "Maybe some good can come from all this pain." "My children," Sarah said hesitantly. "Your niece and nephew. They'd like to meet their uncle, if you're willing." Michael felt tears prick his eyes. "I'd like that. And my kids, they should know their aunt." He leaned forward, taking Grace's other hand. "We can't change the past, but maybe we can build something new, something honest." Through the window, the morning sun cast 3 shadows on the hospital floor, gradually merging into one as they sat together, beginning the delicate work of becoming family. 6 months had passed since that first hospital meeting. The Whitman family's Thanksgiving dinner table had been extended this year, both literally and figuratively. Sarah sat between her children, 11-year-old Marcus and 8-year-old Lily, watching them interact with their cousins as if they'd known each other their whole lives. The sound of their laughter filled Michael's spacious dining room, bridging the divide that had once seemed insurmountable. Grace hadn't lived to see this moment. She passed peacefully 2 months after the siblings' first meeting, holding both her children's hands. But her presence was felt in the framed photograph on the mantel, taken at that very hospital, Grace in the center, Sarah and Michael on either side, 3 smiles bearing the same subtle quirk that James Whitman had passed down to them all. "More turkey, Aunt Sarah?" Caroline, Michael's wife, offered, her initial uncertainty about the situation having melted into genuine warmth over shared family dinners and weekend brunches. "Please," Sarah smiled, still adjusting to the luxury of being part of a larger family. Her children had blossomed under the attention of their new aunt, uncle, and cousins. Marcus was already talking about becoming a lawyer like his uncle, while Lily and her cousin Emma had become inseparable. Michael stood at the head of the table, looking different than he had in his courtroom 6 months ago. The stern judge had softened, though his conviction had only grown stronger. Just last week, he'd made headlines for his speech at the state judicial conference, advocating for reform in traffic court procedures and the implementation of income-based fines. "Before we start dessert," Michael announced, catching Sarah's eye with a smile, "we have something to share." He pulled out an envelope, passing it around the table. The James Whitman Foundation for Educational Equity has been approved. Starting next fall, it will provide scholarships to single parents pursuing legal education. Sarah felt tears welling up as she read the foundation's mission statement. Their father's legacy was being transformed into something new, something that acknowledged the past while building toward a better future. "There's more," Michael continued. "Sarah has agreed to serve as the foundation's executive director." The children looked confused as the adults dabbed at their eyes, but they quickly returned to their animated discussion about the upcoming holiday school play. Sarah watched them, marveling at how easily they'd accepted each other, unburdened by the complexities that had kept the adults apart for so long. After dinner, as the kids played video games in the family room, Sarah found Michael in their father's old study. He stood looking at the wall where the family photos hung, now updated to include Sarah's family portraits alongside the others. "Do you think he'd be proud?" Sarah asked softly, joining him. Michael was quiet for a moment. "I think he'd be grateful that his secret didn't die with him, that his children found each other." He turned to face her, "that we're doing better than he did." Sarah nodded, understanding. They'd both struggled with anger toward their father, Michael for his deception, Sarah for his absence, but they'd chosen to channel that pain into purpose, to build something meaningful from the broken pieces of the past. Outside, snow began to fall, dusting the November evening with fresh possibilities. Through the study window, they could hear the children's laughter, a sound that bridged generations and healed old wounds. Their father's choice 35 years ago had created a divide, but his children's choices had built a bridge across it. To new traditions, Michael raised his coffee mug. To family, Sarah responded, clinking her mug against his. All of it, the hard parts and the beautiful ones. In the corner of the study, Grace's photo seemed to smile, watching over her children as they wrote the next chapter of their shared story, one no longer bound by silence or separation, but free to grow in the light of truth and acceptance.